Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Software Development and Architecture Podcast. This is podcast number 3 in the Prasanna series. We're continuing our conversations with Prasanna Veerasamy, who has taken the time, and thank you Prasanna for taking the time for having a conversation about Prasanna's travels. Prasanna actually, in terms of a quick background, was born and raised in India in Chennai, the same city that I come from as well. But the main difference between the two of us is that Prasanna has been to every single country in the world. Yes, let me repeat that. Every single country in the world. And Prasanna has not just traveled to these countries, he's lived in a number of places, including, Denmark, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, China, the US, and some other countries as well. So we've had two wonderful conversations where I've learned plenty about cultures, travel, and how all of that connects to teams, remote teams, and teams that may or may not be that remote regardless, in a very global capacity, right? So we're going to pick up from where we left off. And before I spill the beans on this topic, I just want to say warm welcome. Thank you, Prasanna, one more time.
Thank you for having me on the third session. Yeah, looking forward to the fun topics.
Super. This one, we ended the last one, and I actually interrupted you. My apologies, saying we're going to save that for the next conversation, which is this one. My question to you was, we've talked a number of continents, we've missed some. Antarctica, Australia, and Africa were 3 that we actually didn't touch upon. I will go to Antarctica, probably. Maybe we can get to it. I don't know. It's very sparsely populated, so we may or may not have a lot to talk about. I don't know. And then we'll talk about Australia, but I want to take this opportunity to talk about Africa in this particular podcast, right? Just by way of background, I've never been to Africa. I've been wanting to go there. I'll certainly be there one day. I had the opportunity to know a lot of people. Like I went to school in Houston. Um, there was a few people from Africa, and there was others who had their origins in Africa, but actually they were second generation living in Jamaica and in South America as well. So I learned some, not enough, but just one more thing to add is the two of us come from Chennai in Tamil Nadu, a city, one of the best cities in India, I would say. And some time ago, I tried to look up, some history, just trying to learn about different things. Because when I talked to somebody who was from Africa, they looked very much, very close to how I look. And the body language and some of the eating habits, I found some similarities. The difference was I'm vegetarian. The person I was, I'm talking about here was not vegetarian. But other than that, there were plenty of similarities. It got me thinking, you know what? I need to dig a little bit deeper. So I dug a little bit deeper. And again, folks, you do your own research. I'm not an expert in this area or any area for that matter. I have a feeling tens of thousands of years ago, when the countries were close together, when the seas were not that far apart, right? There was a certain migration that happened. I want to say maybe from East Africa, folks traveled all the way through to India, to southern part of India, to actually Tamil Nadu, right? The state that the two of us come from. And then they made their way to Australia as well. And that's what got me a bit more intrigued. Now that I've said that as a random premise or a foundation, Prasanna, I want to start with you, who's actually been to this continent as opposed to me, who's just been reading about it and watching. So can you tell us as audience a little bit about Africa, the continent, the countries, how different sort of they are? Because, we might sometimes incorrectly paint a broad picture saying Africa, everybody's got to have something similar, but I really doubt that's the case given the size of the continent. So just like an Africa 101 for the audience who may or may not have a lot of exposure to that part of the world.
Yeah, very happy to talk about Africa. One of my favorite continent, actually my most favorite continent of all the 6. I don't count Antarctica as a continent because it's a piece of land. But yeah, out of these, in Africa, like I've been all 54, right? And why I'm saying that is it's something so interesting because it's not like going to all the states in Europe or going to all the countries in South America, right? Because Chris brought up a point like how monolithic it is or not. Africa is probably the most monolithic continent I've been to. Like again, since you said 101, there are 2 parts of Africa. One is sub-Saharan and Saharan. Like when you talk about North Africa, there are these Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, all the way to Egypt, right? I don't count them as Africa. They're practically Mediterranean Arabia, right? So it's part of the continent, but they look, feel, and belong. You could be in Jordan or you could be in Morocco. You won't know the difference, right? So it's very different. So that if you put that aside, everything sub-Saharan, just below Sahara, it's practically similar. You could be in Chad or you could be in Guinea-Bissau. Apart from the language that divides them, whether French or Portuguese or English, you feel like you're in this same place, right? Because a couple of
Ah,
things that unite them is they are still very, very raw. You go meet people. It's like the old India I was talking to Chris last episode. You feel like you can go into somebody's house, you can sit there, dine with them. You feel like there are no distractions. You feel like the technological advancements and everything have not kind of corrupted or diluted the people. They're still old world, sit outside in a coffee shop in the bench with a paper and talk about like no more mobile phones and kind of a thing like that. That's not penetrated as much. So that's why I think if we look at technology, the penetration of financial instruments or credit cards or any kind of online thing that's happened the rest of the continents has barely even reached Africa, right? So that's why it's very different. And for me, for businesses, it might not be cool because they might see it as an opportunity or they might see lack of opportunity. But as a traveler, I love it because it still feels like something frozen in time. We can keep going back and live the 90s and 80s there. Right?
okay. So I already have a couple of questions for you,
Yeah,
right?
go. Yeah.
One, you mentioned technology. And I think in terms of YouTube usage, I checked it out the other day. I think Africa is the lowest in terms of YouTube consumption, which I can tell, as somebody who consumes it, there's a lot of good, sure. But sometimes, you could aimlessly sit there forever, right? And I'll repeat what I've said in one of my previous podcasts, Now, maybe even it's like a quiz question, right? Let's say if I've said this before, so apologies to people who have watched the other one, but I actually think this is actually not a bad example. My son and I did the math some time ago just to figure out the type amount of YouTube content, right? So if I asked you, let's say today, right? Just take today,
Mhm.
Friday, right? Friday for you, starting midnight, right? When the day turned to Friday, and till the point that the day turns to Saturday, 11:59 p.m. 59 seconds. If all the content that got uploaded to YouTube, not before today, not Thursday
Mhm.
or before, not Saturday or after, just today's content. If a baby were born and the baby's only aim and goal in life was to consume all the content that was uploaded to YouTube
Mhm.
on this given 24-hour window, Prasanna, do you, in your mind, it's just a random question, how long do you think it's going to take that baby to consume just one day's worth of content?
I It's definitely not terabytes. It's way more than that. I would
No,
say
sorry, in
easily.
terms of the number of hours, like how
That's
old
what I'm
should the
saying.
baby be? Yep,
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to think. So I'm translating the
right.
storage to probably no, not one lifetime. I don't
You
think it's
were
one life.
your guesstimate was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. It used to be one lifetime, like 90 years, which was perplexing to me because I took these numbers and I'm like, I was curious to know. And
Mhm.
you're spot on there. Now it's 4 to 4.5 lifetimes, which is 400 years. The baby
Wow.
would have to be immortal to the extent that it has to live to 400 years before the content can be consumed.
Wow.
Just one day.
And you're talking about today, right? Which is like in
I
two
just want
years.
people to digest it, right?
Yeah.
One day's worth of content. Now,
Okay.
let me mention why I try to pop this question or the statement at this point, right? One of the least consumed places in terms of YouTube content is Africa, which is less than 30%, 29%. India happens to be number one in terms of YouTube consumption, right?
Wow.
So
Okay.
let's take, and US is like number 3 or 4, something around that. So if you took somebody in India, their cultural behavior on a daily basis in terms of consuming YouTube, and then you ported them over to Africa or vice versa. And then put those two people together in a room for a whole day as a social experiment. I think it's going to be phenomenal because one person is going to be lost, not getting access to the phone, trying to watch YouTube, but the other person is not. So you mentioned that you appreciated that, and it resonates with me. But let me ask you a more specific question. So, do you think there's many elements to this? It's a very complex conversation to have, but let me trivialize that for the purpose of ease of conversation.
Mhm.
Let's forget about per capita income, purchase power parities, and all of those boring economic details.
Mhm.
Sometimes, right? I intentionally call it boring.
Mhm.
At the grassroots level, if I took three people, I come from here, you've traveled all over the world, but let's pretend that you were just living in India, and then
Mhm.
we go to Africa. Let's say we go to Ghana or we go to Sierra Leone, for instance. We have a conversation. out of the three of us, assuming ceteris paribus conditions where other things are common, do you think one of us is going to be happier than the other? Like, it's a very general question. Just the three of us, one from India, one from US, one from, Africa. We meet there. We just, introspecting life, at that level with what we have and
Absolutely,
don't
absolutely, Africa, right? So I'm going to say something very come from the heart, right? And not just from the travel and observation, but I want to be careful that I don't, offend anybody or say anything that is insensitive, right? But before that, yeah, okay, we've been doing this podcast. My battery is going to die. Do we
have.
have
Okay.
a time to pause for a second so that I can quickly get my charger?
Yeah, absolutely. We can do that. Let me actually even end this here, right?
Okay.
And I'll just call it 4, right? We've had, so, the podcast, I don't try to make them evenly sized, not necessarily so,
Okay.
because it takes a lot more editing to make them evenly sized.
Okay.
So I'm going to say, folks, this is like 1% of the African conversation, the continent conversation we're having, podcast number 3. The next one is going to be the crux of what we're going to talk about here. So I want to end this podcast here and pick up in the next one. Thanks,
Yeah.
Prasanna.
Thank you. And I would like to get that topic that you just said exactly 3 people put in a place who will be happier, right? That's a fantastic segue
And I'm
into
not
what
going
I
to give you
wanted
time
to.
to think. You're going to you're going to charge it, and you're going to come back with your raw thoughts. No time to think. Sorry. Okay.
Perfect, perfect,
Okay. Thank
perfect.
you. Yep.
Yeah.